All right, welcome to our cut flower crop planning webinar. I'm Natanya and I'm the manager of Ruth Bennett Community Farm, and I'm presenting today with my coworker Bella. So I have been the farm manager at Ruth Bennett Community Farm for going on 6 seasons, and RBCF is a project managed by the Chester Housing Authority, which sits on 2 acres of land at the Ruth Bennett homes in Chester. I have formal training in ecological horticulture from the University of California, Santa Cruz. In my time at RBCF, I have developed the farm's infrastructure, including installing a water line and electricity, a walk-in cooler, a greenhouse, a wash station, and a deer fence. I have incorporated cut flower production into our crop plan at RBCF because of my personal love for them. I've also developed our farm's programs, which I'll talk about below. Bella is returning for her 3rd season at RBCF. She had a few seasons of production farming before joining us. She started as a part-time flower apprentice and field assistant, and last year she joined us full-time as our assistant manager and youth coordinator. Programs at the farm include our fresh food distributions. During the growing season from April through November, we have bi-weekly free fresh produce distributions to the Chester community. This used to be a weekly farm stand, but with COVID, we really thought it was important to get the most amount of fresh food to the Chester community. And so we raised funds to be able to do free produce distributions. We have a youth employment program where we employ 10 Chester high schoolers for 8 weeks during the summer. Youth receive on-the-job training in organic agriculture, as well as soft skill development, such as teamwork, timeliness, communication, and public speaking. We also host workshops for youth and take them on field trips to other youth-led programs and projects in the Philadelphia area. We have an adult beginning farmer training program where we provide on-farm training to adults and host workshops which are open to the community. Adults receive stipends to mentor youth and help with community engagement. And then we have our cut flower production program. So our systems at Ruth Bennett Community Farm are that we grow in raised beds, which are about 10 feet by 4 feet and 1 foot high. We have approximately 250 raised beds at the farm, and we grow flowers in roughly half of them, which is around 125 beds or 5,000 square feet of growing space. We sell our flower bouquets from June through October through Philly Foodworks, which is an online farmers market delivering products to the Philadelphia region. They have a flower subscription option, which is basically like a CSA or a weekly add-on option. We also sell wreaths from October to December. We bring in about $20,000 in revenue from cut flower sales to support our programming, which is about 120 bouquets a week. We also give away bouquets for free to the community during our produce distributions. Occasionally, we do event work such as table arrangements for fundraisers or other events. We did the flowers for my wedding, which allowed us to experiment with installation work, and we host a cut flower farm tour every July. And I also just wanted to mention that cut flowers are the highest grossing crop per acre that you could grow. And so this is another reason why we incorporate them heavily into our crop plan. So here's a few photos of the farm during the growing season. And so you want to determine what your goals are for cut flower production. Some examples of retail outlets for your flowers are mixed bouquets through farmers markets or CSA, wholesale bouquets through grocery stores or online sales, wholesale stems to florists, so you could basically be selling by the bucket, design event work, so that's growing your own flowers and then doing the arranging yourself. And then there's also DIY events where people want to do flowers, let's say for their own wedding, and you could sell buckets of flowers directly to a customer. So you want to determine your your growing season needs can be determined once you know your sales channels, and you'll need to figure out the length of your growing season and what varieties of flowers you should grow based on these needs. If you're primarily growing for mixed bouquets, you will want a variety of colors and shapes and flowers that have a long phase life. And you will also want your flower stems to be 18 to 24 inches minimum and straight. If you're growing for design work, you can use show your blooms and shorter stems with a shorter vase life, since flowers only need to look good for a day or so. If you're growing for florists, they definitely want very long stems, and sometimes they have other specific needs, such as wanting curvier stems for arrangements or specific things that you'll just have to determine based on your relationship with them. So I'm going to talk about varieties to grow, but I just wanted to mention that varieties are extremely important when it comes to cut flowers. And my first season growing, I didn't have a greenhouse. So I ordered all of my plugs from a wholesale grower. And I didn't realize that there was this little symbol that denoted that a specific flower variety was for cutting. So I ordered all the flowers I thought I wanted, and I ended up getting stem lengths of about 6 inches max. And my husband joked that I was growing a flower farm for ants. And of course, we love pollinators and we love having them in our ecosystem, but they're not going to be our paying customers. So you really want to pay attention to this. Here's some photos of our bouquets from Ruth Bennett Community Farm. As you can see, as I mentioned, we have a variety of colors and shapes and textures. Here's some photos of flowers from a fundraiser. And here's some photos of the installation work and table arrangements that we did for my wedding. So here are the top 10 crops and varieties that we're going to be focusing on today. We grow probably about 40 different crops and varieties, but we wanted to simplify it to the top 10 that you could start with. These are tried and true. They do really well in our growing zone, and it helps us just narrow in on these when we're talking about our crop plan. The other thing we're not going to focus on today is greenery and foliage, which we use a ton of in our bouquets. And perennials are a great source of this material. You get them established and then they just keep producing for you. So if you have a new area that you're growing in, definitely try to get those in as soon as possible and you'll get a lot of reward out of them. So here's ageratum. Blue Horizon is our favorite variety. And this is a filler flower. Basil, Amethyst Improved, is a foliage. Celosia Pompous Plume is an architectural accent. Dill Bouquet is a filler. Feverfew Magic Single is a filler. Marigolds Cocoa Gold are a focal. Snapdragons Rocket Mix are a focal and an accent. We don't actually grow mixes. We like to hone in on the colors that we want, but anything in the Rocket series will do really well. Strawflower Apricot Peach is an accent, one of my favorites. Sunflowers Pro Cut Gold Light are focal, and zinnias Queen Red Lime, another one of my favorites, are focal. So you heard me mention just the different components of the bouquet. So you want to make sure that your bouquets have a variety of these different elements so that they're full. All right, Bella's going to take it away.
Okay, so today I'm going to be talking about the crop plan and getting into a little bit of how we make our crop plan and what the crop plan is useful for. So yeah, as we start to dive into that process, here are some questions to consider. First of all, what is the point of a crop plan? A crop plan helps us to create an overview of the season. So as we lay out all the plants we want to grow and the plants we need to grow, a crop plan forms the beginnings of a schedule that keeps us on track to meeting the demands of the season. Using our crop plan, we can make schedules for when we need to seed, when we need to transplant, and most importantly, a crop plan allows us to efficiently and accurately predict and schedule succession plantings. So that brings us to what is succession planting. Succession planting, the definition of it is to seed a particular crop at several intervals throughout the season. The point of succession planting is to ensure that we have a consistent supply of harvestable crop. So the essential question becomes, how many successions do I need to seed and plant in order to ensure that I have blooms from May to October? So we'll talk a little bit later about how we monitor if our plantings are meeting our demands throughout the season. But for now, we're going to dive into what a crop plan looks like and what you need to make an effective one and how it can help you plan your successions. So here are some pictures of our sunflowers, and I just wanted to spend a minute elaborating on succession planting because this really well illustrates what the process is. So for our sunflowers, we have a block of 16 beds constantly in rotation throughout the season. And we have 21 plantings of sunflowers. So that means that there's 21 times where we seed sunflowers, transplant sunflowers, and harvest sunflowers throughout the season. And each of these plantings, there are going to be 2 beds. So as you can see in the first photo, we've got some really short ones in the middle bed. In the closer bed, it looks like those could be the same or they could be a bit bigger. But then in the beds in the back, you can see that those are definitely taller. So that shows you that we planted these beds either a week apart or several weeks apart. And then you see, we have the harvestable ones here. So the idea is that if we plant them a couple weeks apart, every week there will be one planting that is becoming ready for harvest. Okay, so successful succession planting. In a minute, we're going to look at a version of our crop plan that includes our top 10 flower selections. But first, I just wanted to give you an overview of what information you need to create a crop plan and what information you can calculate with a crop plan. So the data you need for crop plan and succession planting, first off, is you need the average date of the first and last frost in your region. You need the days before last frost to seed, which is essentially the number of days that it's going to take a particular plant to germinate and become ready for transplantation. So that's the earliest you'd want to seed a particular plant. Then we've got days to maturity, which is the number of days it takes a plant from the point of seeding to be ready for harvest. Then we have the interval between successions. So this is a little bit trickier and somewhat more subjective, but this number basically represents the harvest window of a particular crop. And what we mean by harvest window is when does it become ready to harvest and how many weeks do I have from the point that it is ready to harvest it. So to estimate the interval between successions and essentially the harvest window, we separate plants into one of 3 categories. We've got one cut, OC, medium producer, MP, and cut and come again, CC. So essentially these designations are signifying what type of producer that plant is. So for one cut, that means that you are really just getting probably one stem from a plant. Even if you're getting multiple stems, the most important part is that the plant is not regenerating and producing more stems after that first time that you cut it. So sunflowers is a great example of that. You've got one plant, one stem, one cut. So those you need to be replanting every 1 to 2 weeks if you want to have a consistent harvest of them over the season. Then we've got medium producer, which has a shorter bloom window, but they do probably regenerate a little bit. Something like snapdragons, for example, they're coming in flushes, but they're not going to survive many cuttings. So that's about every 3 weeks. You want to replant those. And then there's cut and come again. So these are plants like zinnias or marigolds, where when you cut them, they actually just start being more vigorous in their production, and you can really get at least 4 weeks out of a bed. So these numbers are based on the most active intervals, and big flower farms, they're replanting things very constantly. But we have a lot of different varieties we like to grow, and we might not always be sticking to such an intensive planting schedule. So from this information, we can calculate the predicted seeding date, the predicted transplant date, harvest date, and pull date for a particular crop and a particular succession, as well as the successions needed to ensure consistency. Okay, so now I'm going to open the crop plan. So we're going to exit out of here quickly. Okay, so this is our crop plan. Let's see if I can zoom in a little bit. Okay, so first off, I want to say, spreadsheets can be pretty intimidating at times and for some people, but creating a spreadsheet for crop planning will really save you a ton of time because you can use formulas. So we're going to explain all the different elements of this crop plan, and hopefully it'll be a little less daunting. At the same time, I also want to say that you can definitely do this on paper. It's just a little more effort. You need to have a calculator with you and that kind of thing. So first off, I just want to point out where all of our information is that we said before. So we've got our first and last frost dates up here. We've got our days pre-transplant to sow, our days between successions, and we've got our days to maturity. And so once we've put all of this information in, and usually what we do is we collect all this information ahead of time for all the crops that we're growing, and we compile that into our cultivation guide. And then when we're making our crop plan, it's really easy to input these numbers. And from year to year, we'll copy the same crop plan and add in new crops as we go. So the first date that you're going to want to calculate is your seeding date, and this is your predicted seeding date for a particular crop. So to calculate that, you are going to, if I click on this, you can see that it actually is a formula, and everything in here are formulas. So for this one, I took the date of the last frost, which we're saying is 420 on average, and I subtracted the days pre-transplant to sow. So that gives me my first seeding date for a particular crop. And then if I go over here to transplant date, you can see that the formula in here is the prior seeding date, that seeding date, plus the days pre-transplant to sow. So we actually have, in this case, the seeding date is 420, which could be a little bit early, but this just gives you an idea of how to get started with thinking about your timing. And then we come over to harvest date. So that's going to be the seeding date that you calculated plus the days to maturity. And then we've got our pull date, which is a new addition this year. And this is going to be really helpful when you are thinking about creating a bed map. So our pull date is partially based on the harvest window, though we might give a particular bed a little bit longer than the interval between successions, but it does give us a good idea of how long we might get out of a bed and when we might be able to put something in that, a new succession in that bed. So then the last thing to show you is how to calculate successions. So over here, we've got our producer designation. So in the case of ageratum, it's a cut and come again. So we said about every 28 days, about every 4 weeks, we are going to try to replant ageratum, reseed ageratum. So for the subsequent successions, it's always going to be the previous seeding date plus that interval of 28. And another thing I just wanted to point out is that we've also got our number of beds here, and that'll be really useful. And right now we might just be estimating that, but later we would update it once we've done all the bed mapping. It'll help us to create some sheets in the future that'll be useful. And then the other thing I wanted to mention is that in terms of the first frost date, this is something that you're going to reference in making sure that you don't have a harvest date that is going too close to your average first frost date. So over here you can see we're expecting that the last time we're going to begin harvesting ageratum is 8/23, and we're hoping that that's going to take us to around 10/22. So that's how we know that we have a pretty good idea that we're going to have ageratum all throughout the season, because we can see that when we are harvesting and when we are pulling, there's an overlap with that next succession coming in. So we seeded the next succession 4 weeks later. That means in 4 weeks, we're going to have a new bed ready to harvest. And that's going to be around the time that this prior seeding is becoming less productive and is going to be getting closer to, we're going to want to pull it. So that is something that you are going to take your own notes on and figure out really what works for you and how often you need to have that, have new harvests coming in. And then the last two sections I wanted to mention are the varieties and the notes. So we don't add our varieties into the main area of our crop plan because we use this crop plan to create several sheets that we really want to be streamlined. And when we add varieties, we find that it just creates a lot of duplicate data and it just creates more confusion in the sheet where we don't really need it. So we do want to be recording our varieties. We record them here and we record them elsewhere. We'll show you that later. And then here's where you're going to keep notes. So it's really important to keep notes on how your successions are doing, how a particular succession did in terms of germination. So that's where we will note those things, as well as if, we had enough successions or if we had a big gap or something along those lines. The last thing I wanted to show you on here are the sunflower succession. So you can see that for sunflowers, we really have, we have 21 successions here. And that means that actually every single week we are seeding sunflowers and transplanting sunflowers and pulling sunflowers. So over here, if you look here, this one, the day when this becomes ready to harvest, we give it about a week. We're pulling that bed. And as soon as that bed's pulled, a new bed is going to be ready for harvest. And that's happening all season. So those are the essentials of the crop plan aspect. And then Tanya's going to talk about bed mapping.
All right, bed mapping. So bed mapping is designing and mapping your growing area. And it's really important because it's an opportunity to put your wishes into reality based on your space constraints. It helps you be more efficient with space and successions. Your crop plan might be wishful thinking in the original planning stages. And once you start mapping it out, you might have to go back and make adjustments based on your actual available bed space. So to start mapping, you want to figure out what your available growing area is. You want to figure out how large your individual beds are, and you want to figure out how those areas can be divided into blocks. So you can determine blocking based on your transplant date and your pull date. And so that's what we do at Ruth Bennett Community Farm. We try to figure out what's going to be in the ground for a similar amount of time. For instance, our dahlia block, our dahlias are grouped together and are sort of put in an area that's a little bit set back because we know they're going to go in early and they're not going to be ready to harvest until the fall. So we try to group those together. And similarly, something like our sunflowers that are just constantly getting turned over, we have all of those in a block as well. So I'm going to pull up our bed map. Basically what we do first is we pull out information from our crop plan. We just pull out the crop, the succession, the number of beds we're hoping to plant, the transplant date, and the pull date. And we're sorting by transplant date initially. And then we're going to follow, so we want the transplant date and we want the pull date for a specific bed. And then we're going to follow that next planting with a transplant date that follows the pull date. So this just helps kind of have a place to just focus on the dates, but you don't need to do this intermediate step. This is what our gate garden is, one section where we have a lot of cut flowers. This is what it looks like. We have 62 beds in this area. And so this is what all of our successions will look like for the season. These blue beds are actually perennials, so those don't ever get rotated. And we do up to 3 successions. So the first one is green, second one is yellow, and the third one is pink. So I'm going to go to this tab, which is just a pullout of that map to show you some examples. So in beds 41 and 42, you can see that we plan to have our first succession of Nicotiana transplanted on 4/19, and those would then be pulled 6/12. That will then be followed by our third succession of feverfew, which we hope to transplant 6/13 and pull 8/8. And that's obviously the transplant date is one day after the pull date of Nicotiana. And then our third succession would be marigolds, which we would transplant on 8/8, which is one day or the same day as the previous succession. So it's a tight window. You might not get to pulling and transplanting in the same day, but it shows, the first available date that you can put something in. Something that's not as neat is up here. We have our first basil succession transplanting 5/10, pulling 7/11. And then the best place to put our cosmos was following this, and the transplant date is 6/29. But this is clearly 6/29 is a few weeks before the pull date is anticipated. So, we might have to bump this back a little bit in the greenhouse or just hold it there until the basil's really ready to come out. But that was sort of the best we could squeeze in. So you just need to play around with it. Sometimes you need to, you're like, oh, I want 4 beds of something. But when you actually look at it on the map, you don't have the available space. So nothing should be done in permanent ink. This should all be, editable, and you should be kind of constantly going back and forth between these documents. And sometimes you might have to decide to pull a bed sooner based on maintenance issues. You might think that something will keep producing, but it turns out that you didn't provide proper crop support. So maybe your stems are really windy and they're just not usable. And so you find that you're spending a lot of time when you go to harvest that bed, and it's just not worth it. We had a big failure of one of our sunflower blocks. They got really tall and leggy, and there was a bad thunderstorm, a lot of wind and rain, and so they kind of dominoed into another bed. So there were like 2 or 3 beds that were just, fallen over, and we had to decide, do we want to try to corral these and, maybe get 50 usable stems, or do we just want to, is our time better spent pulling and replanting? So you just have to constantly make those decisions and then tweak your plan accordingly. But it really provides you with, a roadmap for what's to come.
Okay, so now I'm going to talk about preparing to seed. And I mean, this is really what we're preparing for, with crop planning, and during the winter, we're all just kind of trying to figure out how is seeding going to go and how can we make it run more efficiently. And here's some really pretty pictures of our greenhouse in the spring. Some celosia seedlings. Okay, so when we're preparing to seed, we start by pulling out the predicted seeding dates generated by our crop plan. So I'm going to go back to the crop plan. I'm going to show you how to do that. And then what we do is we need to calculate the number of trays that we have to seed. And essentially that calculation is how many plants are we going to be planting in a bed. So we have a tool that we got from Floret, which has been super useful, which is a plants per bed calculator that then lets us know, depending on what size tray we're seeding, how many trays we need. So I'm going to show you all of that. And the information you're going to need to be able to use this calculator are: what size are your beds? What is the spacing of this crop? What tray size does this crop need? We'll also talk about overseeding. And the great part of this all also is that with all of this information for the following season, it can really help you anticipate the number of seeds that you need to order. So something I wanted to mention quickly in the crop plan as well is that because all of these are formulas, what is really great is that if you update your seeding date, your predicted seeding date, let's say I actually ended up seeding on 3/15/2022 instead of 3/2, that will update the rest of the dates in my crop plan. So if I end up seeding one succession earlier or later, that should affect when I seed the following successions. And, the invaluable aspect of the spreadsheet is that it's going to automatically, based on these formulas I have in place, show me how those dates need to be updated. So when we're pulling out the predicted seeding dates, we need to have the crop, the number of beds, and the seeding date. And it can also really help to just have the successions as well. So we take all of these and we go into an empty sheet. And we're just going to paste it in here. So when you paste, you want to make sure that you paste the values only, since it's coming from like a very formatted sheet. And we can just delete this and just clean this up a little bit to make it more usable. And over here, what can happen sometimes in this column is that when the date comes into a new sheet that's not formatted, it can show up as numbers that don't look like a date. So just so that you know that that's a really common thing, I'm going to show you what that can look like. It can look like it being formatted for some reason as a number. And if that happens, it's just a formatting issue. So it's just that the sheet doesn't know that it's dealing with a date. So you're just going to come into format, number, and then come find the date. And it will make sure that it's in dates. Once you've done that, you can highlight all of this, go to your data tool, go to sort range, advanced sorting range options. Data has header row. That's important that you actually do bring the header row in. And then you can sort by the seeding date. So once we've done that, we can see that now we know what crops need to be seeded on what dates, what crops overlap in terms of what dates they need to be seeded. And we can begin to create a schedule based on this. So once we have all of this information, we create a sheet that looks like this. So basically I've pulled out all of the crops that are being seeded on 3/30/22. And the things I need to know from here are what succession is it? What are the number of beds I'm planning on planting? The type of tray, which I pull from my cultivation guide, which we'll show you later. And then all of these last three are information that I have then pulled from my plants per bed calculator. So the plants per bed calculator has two parts to it. It has the plant spacing sheet, and it has the actual calculator sheet. So you can see in this calculator that basically it's showing us the spacing, and then based on the spacing and the bed length and width and the number of beds, it's telling us how many plants we need, and it's translating that into all of the different types of trays. So one thing that's important to know is that in this calculator sheet, you are only ever editing the yellow cells. So these blue cells here are actually being pulled from the plant spacing sheet over here. Another thing that's important to know is that this calculator only supports spacings, these spacings here. So 4, 6, 8, 9, 12, 18, which shouldn't be a problem because those are pretty much the classic ones. And then just a word about spacing is, spacing actually can be somewhat subjective. So what the seeding packet is telling you that the spacing is of a particular crop isn't necessarily the closest that you could space that crop. So we're always pushing it closer. And in a lot of cases, we find that is great for us because we end up getting a lot more plants out of the bed, and the plants don't suffer. And an important thing to recognize is that for something like sunflowers, if you don't plant them close together, you're going to get stems that are so large that they're basically unusable. So there also are crops that you really want to plant close together to get usable stems. So just to show you here how it changes, if I were to decide I want to be planting ageratum at 6 inches, I'm going to change it in here. Once I've changed it in here, it's automatically changed in here. So basically I've come in, I've made sure that I put the correct bed length and width in there for what bed I'm planting in. I've made sure I put all the correct number of beds in. And then I take that information for the tray size for each crop that I'm planting, and I go back to my seeding date chart and I fill in that information here. And this is where we start to separate into varieties and think about that more. So obviously how much of a variety you seed is going to translate directly to how many beds of that variety you have. So in the case of Agronome, it's easy. We've tried other varieties, but we know that this is the one that we really like. So we're just going to plant all of that. But then when it comes to celosia, we've got a bunch of varieties that we like, but we know that terracotta is actually our favorite. So we're going to make sure that we plant more of that than we do of anything else. Another important thought here is that if you're trying a new variety and you don't know how it's going to do, it's great to just plant half a tray or something along those lines. You don't want to be planting maybe even a full bed of a variety that you haven't tested before. We've done it, and it leads to not really having enough of the type that you want. And especially if the variety doesn't do well, you have a lot of something you don't want to be using. Let me just make sure that I've covered everything here. So the last thing I wanted to say that I don't think I fully mentioned in the crop plan aspect in my crop plan section was that so we start out with these predicted seeding dates, but we also make sure that we are inputting the actual seeding dates and the actual transplant dates and the actual harvest dates. So this allows us to see what we plan to do versus what actually happened. And in some cases, what actually happened was better than what we planned to do. In some cases, it wasn't as good. So it helps hold us accountable and make adjustments for next season. And just reiterating again that when we pull out these seeding dates, we're usually only going to pull it out for about a month ahead, because if we end up seeding things on, drastically different dates, we like to come in here and actually change it so all of the formulas update in the predicted section. And then Tanya is going to talk about the cultivation guide.
All right. So our cultivation guide gives us information about seeding requirements. Here you'll find information such as germination requirements. Does something need light? Does it not want to be covered? Does it want to be covered lightly with vermiculite? It tells us what cell size the seed has a preference for cell size. Potting up needs, for instance, if you germinate something in a 288 cell and bump up to a 72 cell once true leaves are out. Something about cell size is that the higher the number, the smaller the cell. So like a 288 is a very small cell, and something like a 72 or a 50 size cell is going to be larger. It also will tell us our temperature needed for germination. So we use heat mats, usually set between 70 to 80 degrees for almost everything that we're germinating the first few months of the season. It's really important to get the seed up to temperature and the right moisture levels so that it germinates as quickly as possible. As you know, you want it to germinate and grow quickly so that there's like surface area being taken up by the greenery. And this, prevents algae from growing, taking over the cell, and disease from setting in, like damping off and stuff like that. And our cultivation guide also gives us our days to maturity for crops, as well as crop requirements once in the field, like if something wants to be pinched or netted or trellised. So this is what that looks like. So like I mentioned, the crop, varieties we're growing, germination, days to germination, temperature needed for germination, details about sowing. So, sowing 6 to 8 weeks before last frost, potting up into larger cell packs if needed, and then transplanting after last frost. is what it says for ageratum. What tray size ageratum wants to be seeded into. Germination notes for this ageratum, it says do not cover and use a heat mat. Spacing is 8 inches. As Bella mentioned, we're often doing spacing tighter than might be recommended on a seed packet. And, this, in addition to, like something like sunflowers, if it has all the space in the world, it's going to get huge and be a tree trunk. If it's up against another one, it's only going to get so big, and that's beneficial to us for bouquet needs. And then also a lot of flowers, when they're closer together, they support each other. So they help each other grow upright. So we have a lot of success with growing things closer. And it also, so here I mentioned crop requirements. Do you need to pinch? Do you not need to? We pinch many of our crops when they're about 6 inches tall, or when they have about 2 to 3 sets of true leaves. So many people are familiar with this concept when it comes to a crop like basil, but basically you're taking your plant and the plant wants to go bolt and flower and then produce seed. But instead of having it just grow one stem upright, you basically want to come in and you want to pinch out the apical bud, and you want to stop it from growing tall. And then pinching it is going to encourage lateral branching. So where you cut it, 2 buds, 2 shoots are going to develop from the side. And that creates a much bushier plant. And when you're trying to grow flowers for cutting, it will help you get the longest and maximum amount of stems possible. The cultivation guide also has a days to maturity column, and it also has harvest notes. So what stage of the flower, what stage of, the flower being open do you want to harvest at? So that is the cultivation guide. And, we pull a lot of information for our other sheets from this document. And next, I want to talk about record keeping. So as you see, we have a lot of sheets that we use to keep our records. Record keeping makes you a better grower. The point of keeping records is so that you can look back on what you did during the season and make adjustments as needed. For instance, was there a gap in your filler flowers in July? And how can you change this so that that doesn't happen again the next season? So you want to make sure you're updating your actual seeding and your actual transplanting dates and your crop plan to see what you really did and if it worked. And you want to also update your bed maps to reflect your accurate transplant and pull dates. You want to make sure you put tags in your beds and label with the transplant date, which is really important because you might be rushing to get something in the ground and then not remember to record it right away. And then at least if you come back the next week, you have a tag and you can record it when you have a minute. And we also have harvest logs. So we find it really important to record our harvest window and stem count and bucket harvest. So we record this information in the field as we harvest our stems. We're also recording this year our stem count per each succession. So we have a more accurate window of how long a particular bed bloomed for. We use Google Sheets for everything. We both have these on our phones, and any member of the crew, we can also share these with. It's, not everyone likes having their phone on them, and I totally get that. And my phone gets thrown in the dirt all season long. But I do, it's really important that one member of your crew is the record keeper, or that, you're making sure you communicate about a plan. So if you don't get to it right then, you make a note and you make sure you do it, right when you get home. But you just want to stay consistent with your record keeping. So the last thing I wanted to just briefly mention is we're doing a lot of overwintering annual flower trials. So basically we don't have a high tunnel, and there's a lot of crops that are cool loving annuals that want to be planted in the fall, and then they grow and they go dormant over the winter, and then they bloom in early spring in May and June. So this was taken a few weeks ago at the farm, and we've had a lot of success with the following crops: Bupleurum, Bells of Ireland. We've direct seeded those in October. Nigella, Daucus, and Snapdragons we have transplanted in October. And then we've just covered them with Rime over the winter. And in the spring, they start taking off, and they produce lovely blooms with little effort. This year, we're experimenting with a few others that we know other growers in the region have had success with. So we're trying agrostemma, bachelor's buttons, feverfew, larkspur, and ranunculus. And we are also trying to overwinter some dahlias. We've had some happy accidents where we've forgotten to pull some tubers out of the ground and they've just come back on their own. And there's a few growers in the area who really swear by overwintering their dahlias. So we cut them back to the ground. We left only about, 4 to 6 inches of stem length. Then we topped these with about 18 inches of salt hay. You could use leaves. And then we put a tarp over these beds and we weighed them down with anchor bags. So we're hoping those come back in the spring as well. And that is all I have to say about that. So that concludes there's the information for what I just said. That concludes our presentation. Here is our contact information if you have any questions, and this is our website. And now we're going to take some questions that were submitted through the Q&A. So one question is, did you figure out the best cell size for different size seeds by trial and error, or is this info compiled somewhere? So this information is compiled from seed catalogs like Johnny's, as well as from resources from Floret Farm. And it's some trial and error for us as we figure out what works best for our needs. Sometimes we do different size cells in the same succession, so we have some larger plugs to put out and some smaller ones, and just, in case some do better than others. Does Johnny's list the temperature for germination? Yes, they do. Are your succession beds based on soil nutrients? So they're not. We generally just top our beds with a few inches of compost in between our successions, and that takes care of the nutrient needs of most of our crops. Does the crop planting look drastically different for vegetable crops versus cut flowers? It's definitely very similar. In a vegetable crop plan, a crop like radishes or turnips would be considered like a one cut. Kale and collards and other greens, you would treat more like a cut and come again, but the principles are exactly the same. How do you organize your workflow throughout the week? Could you share about your process of learning, some failures or key tips to get the process going? So we have a to-do list in Google Sheets, which is basically we list out each bed, and then we have to-dos per bed and per section. So we'll take a look at, the gate garden beds 42 and 43, what needs to happen, does something need to get planted or pulled or pinched or watered or trellised? And that's just getting constantly updated. We're doing field walks every week, and as something happens, we try to update it in real time. So it was really, the systems definitely took a number of years to get figured out, and it's really been, once I had somebody else full time that was working on these things with me, that was really when I started to figure out systems that were, could work across multiple people. So it's trial and error. You just have to kind of see what works for your size and your systems. But there's many different approaches you can take.
So we have a question here. Could you describe how nutrients are added? So we mostly add nutrient dense compost. Sometimes we add sea kelp as a foliar feed. We don't find that we need many other micronutrients, as compost mostly does the trick. Do you ever vent the covers when overwintering? So yes, especially if we have a week of temperatures above 60 degrees and it's sunny days. We don't use plastic, which definitely requires venting. Instead, we use porous row cover. But in the winter, some of the beds are covered with 4 layers, so it is still a good idea to uncover and allow sunlight to get through if there is a series of warm days. Do you have a good resource for referencing spacing for growing for cut flowers? Yes, we mostly use Johnny's as well as Floret Farm. What are your pest, fungus, disease management practices? So we have a pretty balanced ecosystem and don't have too many issues that don't resolve themselves. We often have aphid problems on our 9-bark in the spring, but just as soon as they appear, so do the ladybug larvae and the ladybugs. So within a few days, the problem usually resolves itself as the ladybugs eat the aphids.
All right. Do you use cover crops to overwinter any of the beds? So we make sure to cover any bed with exposed soil with some kind of mulch, either living or dead, like leaves or straw or salt hay. We often, just because we don't get to it in the fall, we don't always pull out, all of our plants. And so those stay in sort of as a living cover as well. And then we pull those out in the spring. And then any tips for encouraging longer stem length? Pinching the plants, as I mentioned, really encourages long stem length, and also growing the right varieties for cutting to ensure stem lengths of 18 to 36 inches. So that concludes our presentation. We are going to share all of the sheets that we mentioned and showed you today. Just make sure you can make copies of those for yourself, and then you can play around with them as you'd like, and feel free to reach out if you have any other questions for us. Thank you.